Okay, I got a gal review, see who else is here. Okay, hi everybody. Good to see you all. Okay, so I think we will begin. I want to tell the story of a gentleman named Franz Rosensweig, a name that some of you may have heard about, and someone who had a great influence on me and on so many others. And his story is a story not only of being a great thinker, but he had great courage in his own life. And we'll talk a little bit about the details. His life has almost become sort of a legend. I was blessed to have studied with his major colleague student, Professor Nachum Glotzer at Brandeis in the 1970s. Brandeis Jewish Studies Department, Brandeis was one of the first places to have a Jewish Studies Department. Things changed radically in the after '68, and then Jewish Studies programs began to develop, and many of the people who developed them were graduates of Brandeis, as I am, and did my doctorate there. Our key teachers of that time, many of them were people who were refugees from Central Europe, people who were from Germany and Hungary, etc. But their basic quest, and I think they were very successful in it, was to create a new generation of scholars in the United States to carry on the philosophical and historical traditions that they brought with them. When I was in graduate school, Rosenzweig and his colleague Martin Buber were household names. That got displaced about 20 years later by a great interest in Kabbalah. So used to be a time you would go to the bookstore, you'd see an entire shelf of Martin Buber's work. Rosenzweig wrote less, so he's a little bit less known. But let me begin by just telling you who he was and his story. He was born in 1886, in December of 1886. He was born in a city in Germany called Kassel. He was a son of a, I would say, upper middle class Jewish family, a very assimilated family. They were nominally Jewish in the sense that they did belong to a community. They didn't attend very often. They would go to holidays. He received a bar mitzvah, etc. But there wasn't really a great, strong Jewish environment there. And he was a very intellectually oriented young man. And first he thought about going into becoming a doctor, but then he decided to do philosophy and history. And in 1912, he was about 26 at the time. In 1912, he completed a doctorate about Hegel, who was, of course, the most well-known, probably the most well-known German philosophers of the 19th century. But he had many talents, and he was bright, etc. And he was looking for all kinds of ways of expressing himself. And one of the things that was going on in that period, dominated by what I would call Hegelianism. And if I could just you all know about Hegel's idea of progress. So it was progress, science, and a faith in reason. Okay, in that sense, it was a carryover from the French Enlightenment, and it was the age of reason. So what Hegel really believed was that we are on a constant arc towards progress. We were all rudely disappointed by the rise of fascism in Germany. But gradually, when Rosenzweig seemed to have a desire and a growing interest in moving away from what is called just German idealism, and he was getting interested in religion, which was really not necessarily the main focus of Hegelian thought. And he was meeting on a regular basis with a young philosopher named Eugene Borowitz, and they would discuss all kinds of philosophical matters. And more and more, Rosensweig was was drawn to what we today would call existentialism, an existential approach that took the starting point in the situation of the individual person. He felt that religion really held the key to that. And even though he was trained in the sciences and logical criticism and methods of modern historical research, he could not conceive of a Western scholar, and people could not conceive of accepting religion. Now, what was interesting about Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who was from also a Jewish background, is that he began to toy with the idea that for him, the solution to this need for an existential kind of approach was to convert to Christianity. Now, there were a lot of reasons for that. The Christianity that he would convert to would be a very liberal kind, and it was also probably being career-minded. There was still remnants of anti-Semitism, and the chances for advancement in the academy were probably easier for someone who was a Christian and not a Jew. And Rosensweig was taken by this, and also by a cousin of his, who also basically was toying with the idea of converting to Christianity. And he said he thought that was what he would do. So he decided that he would enter into Christianity, but he would enter into it as a Jew. Judaism as merely, as he called it, a personal idiosyncrasy, or at best a pious romantic relic that could not address itself. That was the idea, could not address itself to a modern person in search of an orientation in the Western world. And this was basically the idea that there was no compatibility any longer between Judaism and what was going on around him. So he felt himself that a Jewish intellectual had only two choices at that time. One of this was the growing Zionist movement, which basically was rejecting Europe and many European values if he wanted to affirm his own Judaism, or baptism, if he turned to religion. There were other influences as well. He had a cousin who was also in this situation. So what he does is this. He basically says, okay, I'm going to become a Christian, but first I want to do it as a Jew. And if it was bashert or not bashert, he decides that he would go to his last high holiday service in 1913, and he went to a small Orthodox synagogue in Berlin. And he joined a community of humble people, very different than the people from his own background. There were probably many Eastern European Jews as well in that congregation. And he, as many of us do, went through that great drama of the High Holy Days. The Kol Nidre, the different hymns, the songs, the recreation of the Avodah, the temple service back in the times when the temple stood. And at the end of the service, as you know, at Ne'ilah, there's this declarations that Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and then it says Adonai Hu Elohim, Adonai Hu Echad. And he gets into this, and he's sort of mesmerized. And when the final ram's horn, the shofar, is blown at the end of it, he leaves this service a changed person. And what he had thought he could find only in a church, faith that gives one an orientation in the world, he found that day in the synagogue. And he basically said at that point that he will be a Jew. Now, ultimately, if you will, he's an example of a true Jew by choice, because he had other choices. And what I think finally did it for him, at least according to his biographers, is that he realized that in Christianity, there was always this need for mediation between the human being and God. And the mediation was Jesus. But he felt that what Judaism offered is a possibility of a direct relationship with God that was unmediated. And he took that very seriously. and began a process of self-examination, of study. And in the following year, he basically resolved to return to studying Jewish texts and sources. And he was also convinced that what he could find in Judaism was this existentialist approach, which was so different than the philosophic approaches of the 19th century. The philosophical approaches of the 19th century were basically the idea that what was most important were concepts, thoughts, concepts that were of a general kind, that didn't necessarily deal with the realities of every human existence, every person's existence, which is not something that could be solved or dealt with a concept. It had to do with one's own struggles and one's own ups and downs and hopes and aspirations. And this is what one needed. It was an unmediated connection with God that would help one through one's life. And that becomes a very important word, because at the end of his great opus, magnum opus, the Star of Redemption, which we'll talk about in a minute, the last words are into life. Into life. He's going to basically enter into a living and breathing community. So he became interested in being a teacher, and one of the great things that he will do in his early career is set up a whole series of adult learning. He is the originator of the Maya program, okay? He believed that he had to create a lair house. He used the term lair house, a study house, which would appeal to Jews like himself who have been alienated. And in that group of people, he brought in some of the great Jewish minds of the time to teach, and they taught a whole vast array of getting people acquainted with Jewish classical texts as well as philosophical texts. And he said that this is going to be the important turning point for many, many young Jews who have basically struggled with identity the way he had, and no longer felt that Judaism could bring them to a place in their lives of satisfaction. And he himself started to attend, before he started his own school, classes with Hermann Cohen, another great thinker. We don't have time to get into him tonight. In the Hochschule, which was the academy of the Reform movement in Germany, great scholar, and he was greatly influenced by Cohen as well, and we can talk about that a little bit. His interest in Judaism came to its fullest expression in August of 1918. He was struck by an inspiration of writing a book. And that book was called, as I say, The Star of Redemption. And it became his major work. And he was in the army at that time. It was in the First World War. And he literally, and this is what makes this such a legendary kind of story, he would write the books on postcards, okay? He would write a little bit on a postcard, mail it to his mom, and she kept it. And he did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of postcards. And then when he got home, his mother had collected it. Yes?
He was in the German army?
Yes, because he was a German, right? German army. And in one of the things that also helped him in his continuing development as a Jew was that he was stationed in Warsaw for a while. And in Warsaw, he began to encounter Jews that he had never encountered before. Eastern European Jews, Jews who were pious, Jews who were very much involved in Jewish life of all kinds. And he says, you know, like Hermann Cohen as well. Hermann Cohen was impressed when he visited Eastern Europe. He said how different these are than these alienated or assimilated German Jews, how they are driven by this tremendous personal connection, and how they really understood that as a community, as a kahal, together they could create an avenue or a space to bring God into their lives. He was referring to the enthusiasm of the Orthodox service. If you've ever been to a truly traditional service, you know that it can be a bit raucous, to say the least. At least there's a constant people. I remember the shul there were shuls I know where you would walk around the whole shul during the service. You'd wind up here, then you went there. People were crisscrossing, walking. It had very little of that decorum, if you will, of the Reformed temple, of which he was bar mitzvah in, and of course left soon after. So in this book, which is not an easy book to read, Rosensweig shows his recapturing of the classical Jewish sources. And later, after completing the book and coming back home from the war, he started this Lehrhaus, and then he joined a study group with a very, I would say, liberal Orthodox rabbi, if you could use that term, in Frankfurt, named Nehemiah Nobel. And then it began to dawn on him that there was an extra structure that he has to deal with, and that is the issue of observance. Okay, I've become a Jew. Now, what do I do? And he was not a traditional Jew in any way, but he had to come to grips with the issue of halakha, What does it mean? Well, when he comes back, he begins to study Talmud with another teacher, and the teacher, Dr. Prager's name was, said this guy was so voracious, so enthusiastic. He would come at any hour of the morning, the noon, or the night, and there was nothing he would do more than want to study. The assignments were never enough for him. He had to do more and more and more, and he was able, because he was a very brilliant guy, to absorb so much. Now, the Lehrhaus existed for about 7 years, and it offered 90 lecture courses, conducted 180 study groups, seminars, discussion meetings, and 64 lecturers had participated in the programs. Some of them are very well-known names to you, perhaps today: Martin Buber, Gershon Shalom, Ernst Simon, Leo Strauss, and Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm, the great psychologist. And the greatest peak of enrollment was 1922 to 23, when 1,100 students participated in this year. It was a comprehensive program, and what makes this all more dramatic is that in 1921, he is stricken by a disease which now we call ALS. So it creates a different kind of life for himself. He was 35 years old. He started by losing some balance, etc., and then it got more and more difficult. He was basically not able to move after a while. Then he stopped being able to talk. And there's all kinds of wonderful ways that he tried to compensate for it. When he still could move his hands, he had a sort of a typewriter. He could go with each of the letter. After a while, he couldn't speak, so he would blink his eyes, literally, and people would pass their finger over the alphabet. And he would blink his eyes when he came to, and spell out what he wanted to say. Okay. Now, you might think this was a period where he's going to stop doing anything, but on the contrary, in this period, he achieves quite a bit. He helps Martin Buber translate the Torah, the Bible, into German. Not bad. He translates many, many poems by Yehuda Halevi, one of his favorite medieval Jewish poets. His house became a place of gathering for Shabbat services, as he became more and more, even before his paralysis, more and more traditionally observant. He once said that the reason I like Talmud is that when they put the big Talmud in front of me on my bed, it takes me a long time before I have to have anybody turn the page. It took a while to go through a page of Talmud. He was luckily was able to have a child who was born in 1922, before he became totally bereft of his powers. So the progressing paralysis made him sort of a heroic figure. He never in any way became or fell into despair. And it was really, really remarkable in that way. And his home became a very active center. And his wife, Edith, we married in 1920, was just a remarkable person who, because she knew him so well, sort of served as his transmitter of ideas. She looked at him and she knew what he was trying to get across, whether he was agreeing with somebody or disagreeing, etc. She could read it in his features. So the conversations at his home never stopped. He responded, and you could have full conversations. As one friend wrote, after whoever stepped over the threshold of Franz Rosensweig's room, a friend later wrote, entered a magic circle and fell under a gentle yet potent spell. Behind the desk in an armchair sat, not as one had imagined on a climbing the stairs, a mortally sick, utterly invalid man, almost totally deprived of physical force, but a man well in the fullest sense and free of life's pettiness and constriction. Whoever came to him, he drew into a dialogue. His very listening, this is a very lovely way of saying it, his very listening was eloquent in itself. So he later wrote to his mother about the fact that the words pain and suffering, which you use, his mom was of course trying to console him, seemed quite odd to me, he said. A condition into which one has slithered gradually and consequently got used to is not suffering, but simply a condition that leaves room for joy and suffering like any other. And what must appear suffering when seen from the outside is actually only a sum of great difficulties that have to be overcome. Of course, there's no telling how things will turn out once all means of communication will fail. I dare not think how they would be without Edith. And despite everything, the three of us, I, Edith, and Raphael, his son, praise the day. So we have a very heroic kind of person. So between 1922 and 23, as I mentioned, the beginning of his decline, he translates, and then 1923, he writes a very interesting letter to Buber about the issue of the law. And they basically come up with two different results. According to Buber, Martin Buber, who has a wonderful biography, by the way, has recently come out by Paul Mendes-Flohr, who's one of the great authorities in Martin Buber today. Buber began in different things. I won't go into Buber, that's another talk. But when it came to the idea of what was revelation, what was revealed, so according to Buber, at best, what God could do, what this idea of God is, was he didn't believe in a traditional God, and he was antinomian. He did not observe any mitzvot, really. He worked hard not observing, very hard. He was firm in his lack of observance. He didn't even like to walk into a synagogue. And of course, because he had a nice beard and he wrote about Hasidic stuff, everybody had this impression that Buber was a Chassid. He was far from it. So in this exchange called The Builders, Buber claims that at best what God can do is that God is a commanding voice, a gebot, gives gebot, a command. But that command is not in any way connected with what Rosensweig would say, gesetz, or legislation. There's no content in that command. The command is to be in relationship with God. It didn't have to include any of the legislation, or as what we would call halakha. And they differed on that. During that period, he also began to collect his writings. And then, of course, the great thing, of course, was the translation of the Bible. And he did it in a special way. And Everett Fox's translation of the Torah, if you've seen it, also has the book of Samuel and a few other things, is based upon the philosophy behind the translation of the Bible with Buber. And they talked about the sound of Hebrew and how any translation to be quote unquote accurate had to be able to maintain somehow the rhythmic sounds of Hebrew. And that's why when you read Everett Fox's translation, it is not English. It's very poorly written. It's not flowing English prose. On the contrary, it's trying to capture the sound, the Klang in German, the Klang, the sound of what Hebrew was, in order to make the text not just a book to read, but a book to experience. Also started using different translations, which were far more accurate and related to the Hebrew. For instance, the first one, Buber and Rosensweig, to translate Korban, right? You know, as we often talk about in Bible class and the Torah class, not as sacrifice, but as coming closer offering, which is what the word comes from, karov, to become close, not sacrifice. Sacrifice doesn't mean anything, really. It's not, Korban is not a sacrifice. So little things like that, all through the translation, sort of reverberated. So for instance, if there were double words, he would put them in as double words rather than just trying to, finesse it and make it smooth. And it was a very important translation because at that point, the major translation in German was Martin Luther's. There were other attempts at translations, but this was an echt Jüdisch, if you will, a really authentic Jewish translation. Finally, he succumbs after quite a few years of this condition, and he dies in December 8th, 1929. And he had a rather short life, but as I say, it was filled with tremendous intellectual and spiritual content. So let's get a little bit to his thinking. And what was he all about? Well, as I say, Rosensweig's legendary life added a great deal to his understanding of the world. And the background of his thought is a Judaism that is based on, he believed that his approach was based on a general philosophic orientation, which represents a break with the intellectual movements prevailing at the beginning of the 20th century in Central Europe. And there are others who shared in this break. Perhaps the most well-known is Kierkegaard, the Dane. He was a Danish thinker, and the most perhaps well-known person who wanted to upset, as he said, the apple cart of philosophy forever, that was Friedrich Nietzsche. This is all happening at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. So his criticism of German idealism is advanced in this idea of getting back to classical Jewish thought, to get to a place of existentialist philosophy where what is central is the human being. What is central is the human being. We now accept so much of this. He had such influence through so many scholars who came after him. And so we now take this as, really? There was a time when that was not the case? We sort of take it with for granted. Of course, we should start with the human being and the human situation. Of course, existentialism became very popular, if you remember, after the Second World War with Camus and Sartre and others, right? That the human situation is what is central. And then he'll expand upon that, and I'll hopefully share that with you. So he called this revolution, quote unquote, the neuen Denken, new thinking, the new thinking. So Rosenzweig says, being precedes thought. Thought is dependent on being. You may have heard the great statement, I think, therefore I am. Have you ever heard that? René Descartes? He would say, no, I am, and thus I think. Very radical in a way at that point. And this new thinking, as Rosensweig called it, starts with the living, suffering, doubting, hoping human being, and with what his common sense finds at his disposal when he faces the real world around him. And in this view, and this of course is now totally accepted by so many, in this view, there is not one absolute, one whole, W-H-O-L-E, as Hegel thought, but three parts of a whole. And those three parts are God, the world, what he says man, but we can say humans. He was writing at a time when gender was usually male. So, God, world, and man. I want you to picture these as a triangle, with God here, okay, in the corner, with the world, and then a man. Okay, so you have that triangle. The traditional Jewish triangle, and I've often reinterpreted Rosensweig to do that, is God, Torah, and Israel. Okay, God, Torah, and Israel. That's my interpretation of it. But he's basically saying that one could never be reduced to one another. They're separate elements, which most people would agree, but there's a way of creating a sense of it coming all together through our relationship to those three things. So how we relate to God, how we relate to the world, and how we relate to other human beings ultimately is what can make this a new kind of whole, which has these components in it. So God, the world, and humanity are no longer isolated elements. They appear in a process of constant interaction, and only mutual contact makes them actual and transforms them into what we call reality. And he says the way we do it is through three concepts that are very well known, and that would be the second triangle going down. So you'll notice we'll get a star ultimately, triangle up and a triangle down. And these three things are creation, revelation, and redemption. Creation, revelation, and redemption. In creation, God makes himself visible. He's no longer hidden because he is visible in creation. And this process of creation, and here he may have been influenced, who knows, by some Zoharic or Zohar idea that God was searching for relationship. And that's the reason the world came to be, because relationship. And I had one teacher years ago in the Hebrew University, Michael Rosenstock, Michael Rosnack, great teacher, who explained it like this. He says, we are captured emotionally by creation. We go out and see the sunrise or the sunset, and it's marvelous. It's exciting. And he said it's like seeing the woman or the man or the partner, whoever you see for the first time, and fall in love. But it's puppy love. And it feels like maybe for some people it used to feel like having the flu. It was discombobulating, but it was puppy love. It is only, later Rosnack says, in Revelation that God calls you again and says, we had a great time, but it was not that serious, but I want to call you again and I want to have a more serious relationship with you. And the way to do it is through revelation. And as you know, I've often talked about this idea, I've embellished on it, about the fact that what happens at Sinai, what happens in our sense of revelation, is that we are given an opportunity for creating intimacy. He talks about love, that it's true love when you make a commitment to someone, instead of just this puppy love, the excitement of creation. But you need to have that capacity for commitment, or as what we call in our tradition, brit, or covenant. And that is what established it. So the contents of the ever-renewed and this is also very important, ever renewed and ever present revelation is God's love for man. And I'm quoting for him, man, in becoming conscious of the fact that he is created and loved by God, becomes a self, capital S. The way in relationship with the other, true relationship with the other, helps you become yourself. Okay? So you get that? That's what happens. So God's love awakens in us the faculty to respond, but more importantly, to relate himself to others. Not the big other with the O, God, but to others with the small o. To love. God's love for man is the origin of the divine mitzvot, the commandments, and the first among them of the commandment to love one's neighbor, who is created being just like himself. That's why you love your neighbor. You love your neighbor because he too, or she is a creature, part of creation. So man's love for God is constantly being translated, at least in our tradition, into meaningful action in the world. Meaningful action in the world. And this is why there's a challenge for us. All too often we feel that certain mitzvot or certain obligations don't necessarily help us express that relationship to the other. But the world in which such action is called forth by love, if love becomes the motivating factor, then mitzvot will not become mechanical, will not become neutral, blind laws, but as he says, a sacred ground on which God and the human person meet. Neither is any longer isolated, hidden in impenetrable solitude, but both God and humanity are manifest and acting upon a real world. And again, he realizes what he's saying is not brand new, because he found all this in his return to studying the classical texts of Judaism, which were foreign to most people, who had no idea that Judaism offered this existential position that one could be in, that ultimately it is an act of love to be a creature in the world, because creation was an act of love. So you have creation, revelation, and redemption. And we'll see that they will interact with the top triangle, and that will be, I'll speak of that in a while. Now, as creation points to revelation, in which the intention of the creator is fulfilled, or the suitor, let's look at it as a suitor. The suitor brought you beautiful flowers on the first date, but he didn't call the next day. I don't know if you've ever heard this problem of a man not calling or a woman not calling. It happens. It's unfortunate. But when he comes back, he brings more than just a bouquet of flowers. He brings him or herself. That's better than the flowers. And hopefully it does not wilt for a week or two, right? Because you're bringing yourself into the relationship. So revelation also then leads us to the theme of redemption. Redemption. And what that means is that there is this notion in our tradition of perfection, of eternity. And by translating, if a person translates his or her love for God into love for his neighbor, that takes part in leading the world towards redemption. Of course, this is part of the messianic ideal. He knew a great deal about that. And he also believed that the practices of love, etc., will not only repair the world, litaken olam, but everybody forgets the two words after that. In the second paragraph of the Aleinu, we have a term, litaken olam b'malchut shaddai. We want to repair the world in the kingdom of Which and I have been separated.
You froze for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'll go back to a minute. So I don't know where I froze. I don't know what I was saying at that point, but whatever. Let's go back then a moment. He's saying, so the way creation points to revelation as the next step in relationship, and the next step is that revelation points to a place of eternity and perfection, which we would call redemption. In classical sources, there are two kinds of redemption. There is personal redemption, and there is, if you will, global redemption or universal kind of redemption. So he hopes that by our doing, inspired by this love, that what we do, and this again, he gets from classical sources, creates this partnership in repairing the world between God and ourselves. So death can be somehow transcended by redeeming love. Redeeming love is a term that he uses, and he quotes from the Song of Songs, "For love is strong as death." So the idea of future fulfillment, of continuity, of eternal life, implied by the term redemption, is not confined to something that is beyond earthly time or a hereafter. This is what's very important. And again, I say all of us have been deeply influenced by this, because what we do in the expression of love is see that things have been given to us so we can somehow experience this sense of eternity within us. How? Well, Shabbat. And we talk about that a great deal. Shabbat is me'ein olam haba, as if we were in the next world, as if we were in the next world. And of course, when we go up to the Torah, many of you have had an aliyah, the second bracha, you say, V'chaye olam nata betochenu. And you have implanted in us, in our midst, eternal life. So eternity is not something that's only in the future. Eternity is a capacity that each of us can embrace and bring within oneself. So in this new thinking that Rosensweig called, and I'll give you a moment to react, this new thinking, as he developed it, assigns a central position for the human being in life. And the new thinking concerns itself with each individual, not with humans in general, or humanity in general, which was the way the philosophical systems of German idealism. Remember the Kant, right? The categorical imperative. What is good for the concept of the largest group, right? But doesn't necessarily deal with the individual. He was trying to overturn that. In Rosenzweig's religio-philosophical thought, man is seen as actively engaged in a life of meaningful responses to God and world, a life spent in the presence of the one who is beheld, and this is very much akin to Buber a little bit, who is beheld in his relationship to man and to the world through the modes that we talked about: creation, revelation, and redemption. So this is a sort of a basic outline. Buber will take it even further, because Buber's God is not a God at all that necessarily demands of us personal observances or actions, because it's only gebot, it's the command, the beruf, I think they call it in German, beruf, the calling. God can call you, right? And you stand in that presence, but that's that he would go in when he enters Buber, when he enters into his what he would call dialogical period. He writes I and you, ish and du, which has been mistranslated as I and thou, because in German du is not thou. Du is this personal, you. So he's trying to say, in a way, that it is in the encounter of I and you, right? Ish and du, in that encounter, that's where you find God. So it is the human encounter for Buber that brings God into relationship. So I'll talk a little more about a few other things, but I just wanted to just leave it for that for now because it's quite a bit. And we'll talk a little bit more about his political stances and so. Okay, guys, whoever wants to speak, unmute yourself and let yourself be heard.
I just sent you a question, Reb Moshe. You used the concept antinomian, and I had come across that.
Can you put your volume up?
Your volume up a bit.
What?
Can you speak up a bit, please?
Oh, sorry, I have a That better?
A little better. You try it.
Yeah. So you used the word antinomian,
Right.
and I recently encountered that with my Hevruta partner in studying Gershom Scholem, and I never understand what it means. Could you
Okay.
explain?
Glad you asked. Some people are often embarrassed to ask. The Greeks translated the word for Torah. The Greeks translated Torah as nomos. Nomos, law. Okay, so the Torah, the quote unquote Old Testament, was law, whereas the New Testament was love. I often make the joke, you want law? Stay a Jew. You want love? Become a Christian, right? And so they created this sort of the dichotomy, right? So to be antinomian is to be against the law. We're not accepting the law. Okay, so an antinomian it has that characteristic. Buber was sort of an antinomian. He didn't see the idea of gesetz, of legislation, that there is any content of legislation. Now, I don't want to take away from Buber. I don't think, he went to eat chazer on Yom Kippur, in the middle of the street and did that stuff. But the bottom line, he didn't see a value necessarily in taking on what we call mitzvot. Because mitzvot is usually understood, we try to understand it differently in TBZ, but mitzvah is usually understood as commandment, which means that is obligatory. You get it? It's obligatory. Whether you have kavanah, intentionality, or not, you got to do it. It's the law. Okay? You got to stop at stop signs, whether you feel like it or not. If you feel like it, you must be very happy when the car stops. If you don't feel like it, you go, damn it, I've got a red light. Right? That's how you feel sometimes when you miss all the greens, Right? Going up Second Avenue, down Second Avenue. So the red light can really get you pissed. So basically, he was saying that to see the Torah as not given its true translation, which is guidance. That's what Torah means, is guidance. A teacher is a moreh, right? A parent is a horeh, a horim, our parents in Hebrew, moreh, morah. It's a teaching, it's a guidance. That's what Torah means. It doesn't mean law. And even the word halakha is mistranslated as law. Halakha means path. Path. Right? We have ancient wisdom paths, right? We have Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism, and these are paths. And these paths go on until wherever your tradition thinks it leads you. But you have to be on the path. You don't want to be off the path, because that's what they call now all these books now about people who have left the Hasidic community, or the movie Unorthodox, right? That's called off the path, the genre of off the path writers, which is off the derech, right? They're off the derech. They've been off the path. Now, what's the criticism of being off the path? Obviously, is one, if you're an Orthodox person, is that you will be bereft of guidance in your life. You will lose the capacity to live a decent life. And I think most of us have paths, whatever they are. We have created paths. We don't want to be dragged through life willy-nilly on the side of the path, having our our head hit every lamppost down. We would prefer, I think most of us, in the paths that we have chosen in our lives. Some people, certain careers, certain ways of dealing with others. We all have paths, and I think that's what how I think halakha has been misinterpreted. So that's what antinomian is, Evelyn. Who would like to say something? Alan.
Oh,
Alan, and we'll get to everybody. We have time.
okay.
So I took what you said pretty literally, I think, maybe too literally, and maybe with too much of a limited understanding. But it seems to me that what Rosensweig seems to have accomplished is he found faith. You know, that he sort of rediscovered faith, and then he spins it in all kinds of different ways. But I'm trying to understand what is the major contribution of his thinking and what is different from what was already, you know, proposed earlier by other people who either did or didn't have faith. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's based on like really extreme or super rationalism.
Well, it's not. It's definitely not a faith that is in any way rational. Okay, because as I say, he was reacting against the science of reason.
Yeah.
That things have to be reasonable. That faith challenges reason. I'm not talking now about belief. Okay, make a distinction between faith and belief. Right. Rosensweig was once asked after he came out of shul. During the parsha of Balak, where Bilam's ass talks. Remember that famous story? And he says, Herr Rosensweig, Herr Dr. Rosensweig, you are a professor, you study the Hegel at the university. How can you believe that an ass talks? And he says, when I'm in shul, in Balak, the ass talked. But if you're asking me to sign an affidavit that donkeys can talk, I probably would not. He also had a wonderful word about what a drasha should be. It's a very interesting thing, what a sermon should be. A drasha should not be provocative in the sense that it would create dissension. A drasha, and I think we do it very well in our community, a drasha is something that brings you together. So he would say you don't want controversial drashot necessarily in shul. We're lucky we have pretty much, I wouldn't be total, but we have pretty much people on the same page. So it's, when you give a drasha, you don't get people standing up in the middle and saying, "Hey, you're a communist. Hey, you're a Marxist. Hey, you're an anti-Zionist," whatever it is. You know, whatever it could be. Yes, anybody else? Before I go on to the next thing, because I want to talk a little bit about Zionism and politics. Yes, Mona.
I was always under the impression that the Eastern traditions talked about the idea of perfection a lot more than Judaism does. That Judaism wasn't really espousing perfection in the same way, maybe working towards being a better person and being a work in progress, but perfection wasn't something that was necessarily attainable in this world. And
it's right. It's what he's saying, and I think what we all say is that in order to have the wherewithal, if you will, to continue to work towards that worldly perfection, which Judaism does believe in. We believe in this idea that the world will be redeemed. This is our Mishagas. It's a major Jewish Mishagas. In order to supply it with energy, supply that seeking with energy, we have the capacity to experience it, glimpse it, even while we are in our own world. And that's what Shabbat's do. That's what he would say the Shabbat does. That's what receiving Torah every time you go up to Torah. What is Torah? Chaye, right? Olam nata betochenu. I have accepted this eternal life that is within me. There's an eternal life that's within you.
right.
And there's also, hopefully, an eternal life that will be there for the entire world. But you have to have the capacity to somehow get a glimpse of that. What could it mean? What could it possibly mean to be in a world where you don't have to worry about your sustenance, or not have to worry about so many things that we try not to worry about on Shabbat?
But it's a glimpse, not
A glimpse.
that you can become perfect in this world.
Probably not. However, I do believe he has a strong feeling that all of us have capacity for perfection to a certain degree, but we're limited. We're limited. So this is why, for him, what the greatest thing you can do that will give you a sense of perfection is to love the other. Now, you can never even love perfectly. It's not possible either. But there's something about being in love with something in your life, whatever it is, to be in love with it. Now, to be in love would mean that you basically have that in front of you all the time. And that is a glimpse of what the world could be, a place where people could be in love. Why? Because every other human being is a creature like you are. It's so simple. And yet it got philosophized out, in the 19th century. And this is what Rosensweig is rebelling against. As I say, he influences so many people after that we now accept so much of this as, yeah, sure, of course. But this is 100 years ago.
Thank you.
I can't believe it's 100 years ago already, right? We're now in 2020. This was all done it was in 1918 to 1921. It's 100 years ago. So we can't necessarily say that our consciousness now in 2020 was the same as the consciousness of people in 1920 on these issues. Yeah, who else? Yes, Marilyn. You have to unmute.
Sorry.
No
This
problem.
might be simplifying him to some degree, but when in his youth, he comes off as being extremely naive and extremely, I don't want to say gullible, but I'll do this or I'll be Christian. Or, I mean,
It took a number of years. He didn't do it over, this is years.
No, I understand,
yeah.
but I don't know. I just feel like it's like an accidental leader or an accidental religious thinker or whatever you want to call it. I can't, he doesn't resonate that much for me. Like hearing about, I know that you taught this to our synagogue, my other synagogue, like 25 years ago. And I had this very similar,
Well, I'm saying, look, it's like it didn't happen like it happened to St. Paul, right? Where he fell down Saul, right? And he came up Paul, right? This total transformation. As a matter of fact, he gave this so much thought that he said, how can I do it in an authentic way? And the only way I can do it authentically, become a Christian, is to do it as a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Christianity was claiming, and the claim of Christianity, which he thinks still has a role, by the way, in the world. He's not denying the role of Christianity.
Right.
I'll explain that in a moment. Is that in order to be authentic, you have to see, and this is what most Christians will tell you, Christianity fulfills Judaism.
Right.
It fulfills a Jew.
Yep.
So to be a fulfilled Jew, you become a Christian.
Yep.
Right. You become a Christian. Now, as I say, there were also external reasons, because, as I said, there was still lingering anti-Semitism. Never went away. And we know that there's a famous fellow who converted about 100 years before him, who said, Moshe, why did you convert? So, well, if I had stayed Jewish, I would be a Malamed in the Cheder, in my little town in Poland. But now I'm a Christian, I can apply to the university in Berlin. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think for him that was the case. But I'm saying there were people who had really very practical reasons in order to do so, because they were alienated from their Judaism anyway.
Right.
They didn't see anything authentic there. Right. Franz Kafka is another example, by the way. Exactly very similar. He has a wonderful collection called Letters to My Father. I don't know if you ever read a very complicated relationship with his father, Kafka. Franz Kafka.
Kafka, yeah.
Another Franz, right? But he was living in Prague. And he describes going that, his parents were totally not observant about the high holidays, right? So you got dressed up and you went to the big Reform temple and you had your special buggy that you went to on Yontif. It was a big deal, and everybody wearing fancy clothes and hats. And he says, when they opened the ark, he thought they were opening up a shooting gallery like at the carnival. It was opening up, you see all these little torahs. You say, boom, 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 boom. That was his impression as a kid of what was going on, when he saw the externality of
Right.
Kafka, too, is a very fascinating example of someone who, I'll use a terrible pun, he metamorphosizes.
Okay.
And maybe the story of the metamorphosis is his story of taking on a more authentic Judaism.
Okay.
Etc. Right. Anyone else? Yes, Michael Krieger.
If Rosenzweig spent a year at TBZ and he got to know us and saw what we do, range of koshers, et cetera, are there things where he would say, you really don't have to do this as much as you are, or things that he would say, you really should start doing this?
His basic approach, he personally did become more observant. Also, he had, to be honest, his illness permitted him a lot more capacity to be observant because, he was paralyzed for a long time. But his approach was this. Someone asked me, someone would ask him, Herr Dr. Rosensweig, I understand you're getting interested in Judaism. Are you putting on tefillin? He would say, instead of no or yes, he'd say, not yet. Not yet. As he often said, nothing in Judaism is alien to me, but I don't take it all on. So he still had that room being for, quote unquote, making our choices that we make. And those choices are choices that you make. And you might say, well, I'm not keeping kosher now, but who knows? I mean, he would say being doctrinaire about anything is creating your own little, if you will, ghetto of experience, So he said, not yet, maybe, it's part of Judaism. Maybe I'll try that. Who knows? But right now, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm not part of a Jewish community and Jewish life. So I think he would have little trouble with being in a community, because I'm sure the community of the Lair House at the school that he's down were precisely like that. People coming from every kind of background. They didn't check your tzitzis. It wasn't a yeshiva, okay, where they would check your tzitzis before you came in. Are you doing all this stuff? Okay, maybe then we'll take you in, etc. No, he wouldn't be like that at all. Anyone else? Okay, so I'll just go on with two more things. He was enamored, and this was, I think, very important for him, and it came at a time when Hebrew was being renewed as a language. He was a true lover of Hebrew, classical Hebrew as well as modern Hebrew, but he was not a Zionist. And Zionism was getting to be quite more open in the 1920s in Central Europe. Buber, for instance, became a Zionist, a very left-wing Zionist, but a Zionist nevertheless. And many others of his colleagues and friends were. And many of them actually had the smarts to leave Germany in 1933, with the rise of Hitler, and go to Palestine. And many of his friends and colleagues did. He didn't ever live to see Hitler, so I don't know if he would have changed his tune, right? We don't know, right? He died before 1929, so he didn't see the Hitler coming to power, but he did know what was going on, obviously, in the streets. So one of the reasons he had a problem with Zionism was because he believed that what kept Judaism going and kept Jews going is that we were ahistorical. We did not necessarily live within history. We lived in a meta-historical way. We lived above it, and that's what helped us survive. We did not die with the death of the Roman Empire. We did not die with the death of the Hittites. We didn't die with the death of the Egyptian culture. Our culture somehow was ahistorical. It had something above history. And what he felt that Zionism might do is bring Jews back into history, which could lead to the end of it. The minute you're historical, it could be the end of your existence as well, as we know from our history. Empires come and empires go. There's no permanence. Even when we were historical, right, before the destruction of the Second Temple, guess what? We were exiled twice. And we thought it would be the end, but then we created Judaism. And Judaism was able to survive by not being territorially connected. So for him, like others in his world, the idea that the temple was destroyed and Jews were dispersed through the world was a positive. It kept Judaism alive. And like others, particularly in the Reform movement, there was a reason for why we were dispersed through the world, because we had to bring the world something. And for the Reform movement, that was called ethical monotheism. That was our goal. Our goal was to alert the world to this idea of ethical monotheism. And that was why we had a mission. That's the term that the Reform movement used, a mission theory. We had a mission in the world, and that mission was to bring the idea of this ethical monotheism. So would have he accepted if there would have been a state? Look, Buber was finally moved to Palestine in the late 30s. And he was, as I say, a Zionist, and he became what later on will be called a binationalist, which today would be considered to be very radical. He believed that there should be an Arab-Jewish state together, 2 states. He was very concerned about what it meant to live in an Arab world and not be able to see them as partners in building this new idea of Zion. So when he came to Israel, he may have been very upset about what was going on. It's quite true, and he spoke out. But he eventually came to grips with the fact that the world is better with the state of Israel than not. And I think Rosensweig would have come to that as well, particularly after what went on in the years 1940s. So let me summarize it. He was very dissatisfied, as many of us are, and I think we share this, I think at TBZ and many of us. He was very dissatisfied with very shallow definitions and surface performance of modern Judaism. Rosensweig penetrated into the depths of classical Jewish thinking and demonstrated that it is possible to give it meaning today. Some of you are graduates of Mea, and I just brought that up because Mea is precisely what Rosensweig started. How do you get adults to get away from their childhood perceptions of what it means to be a Jew? I like the term. Now we can argue about this, but I don't like the word Jewish as much as I used to. I used to like. If a person is Jewish, it's like blackish. I'm like a Jew. I'm not a Jew. I'm Jewish, you know. It's a little part of. I'm Jewish. But to be a Jew is to be someone who stands as a Jew in that relationship with the divine and with others. I do it not because I'm Jewish. I do it because I'm a Jew. And as a Jew, I have that sense of commitment, and that's what he was fighting for. And one of the great influences that he did was on Mordechai Kaplan, who, of course, we all know started this idea of Reconstructionism within the conservative movement, and it was considered to be very, very much the same idea of people-centered Judaism, not a rabbinic-centered Judaism, but a people-centered Judaism. That was considered to be one of the reasons we are who we are today. Kaplan was probably as important. I didn't pick Kaplan because his work is fairly well known. So I'm going to end with a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr, some of you may have heard of, was a great Protestant theologian at the beginning of the 1950s, 40s and 50s. He taught, I think, at Union Theological Seminary. He was friends with many Jews. He was very philo-Semitic, which was rare in those days. He says, Rosensweig's thought has the power of creatively renewing what seemed conventional and even dead. Rosensweig's thought has the power of creatively renewing what seemed conventional and even dead. So Rosensweig's call to review our sources, the Lehrhaus idea, and the example of his own attempt at interpreting the ancient books in the light of present-day needs are probably as important as his teachings. This idea in the fact that we can become, and this is a very important word, it's used in German, we can become gebildet, Bildung, to be literate, to be educated, to be sophisticated, to understand that in order to make it in the world, our Judaism has to have that capacity of sophistication, nuance, the ability to adjust, the ability to see what's going on in the world, to feel it existentially, that this is an existential issue. It's not an issue necessarily of concepts, ideas. It's not an idea. It's how do I do it? How do I struggle with it? And I'm speaking to the choir, because here you have everybody in our little room tonight. Are people I know who think about this a lot and struggle with it. What does it mean? I came into this world in this reincarnation, in this incarnation as a Jew. And I'm glad to see that a lot of Rosenzweig's methodology, particularly educational philosophy and all that, has become the mainstream, the backbone of creating a vibrant, lively, creative community. And all of my great TT teachers, and I think any teacher in Judaism that is worth his or her salt, is always talking about how do we renew it. Never accepting it as it is. How do we renew it? How do we make it fresh, enticing? How to make it, as some ladies in Miami would say, how do you make it delicious? I love that word. Oh, he's so delicious. Right? That's really, or in Yiddish you would say, oh, geschmack. Geschmack. Oh, it's tasty. Oh. That's what we hope will happen with our education for ourselves. We hope we get it to our kids as well, that there's a tastiness to it. And how do you know if it's delicious or not? You got to taste it. It's not going to come out of a book. You taste it. You want to know about Shabbos? Try it. You don't like it, you go on to the next course. Right? But the bottom line is, you never can get the opportunity of truly doing it without being tasteful. Mona's saying goodbye. See you next week, perhaps. I'll just talk about who our next people
I'm
are
saying
going to be.
hi. I just wanted to be able to thank you. That's all.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. It's always very, very good. So we'll be dealing with a number of other thinkers that some of you may or may not know. Perhaps the name that you know most is Hannah Arendt, but very few people know about her Jewish writings. And that's what I wanted to explore with you. Also, the controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem, if you remember that great controversy. And Hannah Arendt is known as the major political historian for her book on the origins of totalitarianism. A great scholar, a great woman, loved to fight with people, was great. She was really a feisty. There was actually a film made about her not too long ago. And boy, she was quite a woman. She even had a little relationship with Heidegger, but I don't want to get involved in gossip, but whatever, who was a German philosopher in the 1930s. And then we'll talk about Eugene Borowitz, a name that some of you may have heard of, but he was a great teacher and philosopher at HUC, JR in New York, taught many generations of Reform rabbis, had the opportunity of meeting him a number of times, very just a terrific human being, and had a great influence on where Reform has gone. He was always interested in where Reform is going to go. He wasn't as interested in where it was. So where's it going to go? And a lot of his thinking has informed where Reform has gone to be much more, if you will, concerned about traditional observances, etc., which was not the case earlier. And then we'll deal with a man who you may not know at all, which I really recommend that we get to know, is Arthur A. Cohen. Arthur A. Cohen was also similar to a Rosensweig in story. We'll get to him. He was a publisher, a writer, a philosopher, an art critic. He was one of these Renaissance people. Unfortunately, died at 58, taken from us. And his major, he was a novelist. He was a philosopher. He was a professor, not a professor. He was an adjunct. But he ran a salon. He was one of those people who ran a salon in New York with Sidney Ozick and all of these wonderful writers and philosophers who came together and cross-fertilized all their ideas. You may know a book. It's a big book. It's actually out in paperback now. It's called Contemporary Jewish Religious Thought. It's a big volume, and it goes from A to Z with Jewish concepts. And he's had some of the greatest scholars writing little pieces. They're all little pieces, like an encyclopedia. So you go from A to Z, and you cover all of Jewish thought in one volume. It's a big volume, though. But what's good about it, you read a piece and you put it down. You don't have to keep reading it all the time. So it's called Contemporary Jewish Religious Thought. I believe it's still in print. So there are many other thinkers that you probably have not heard of a lot, but who has been very, very important in my life. I think that's part of why I bring this to you, because part of my job is to push forward what I get. That's all I can do for my teachers. That's the greatest. What else can I do? I can write them a note. Most of them are dead, but my job is to push it forward, and then some of you might push it forward, and some might push it forward. And this is how we do it. We tell the stories, and we give over the ideas, and we give over the fact that all of us, and I think this is so important, all of us, my teachers have always impressed this upon me. All of us are struggling human beings in a complicated place called the world. And you have to start there. And that's where the existentialism has really made it deep in me. You've got to start with the individual and what the individual struggles are in our lives. And wonderful times too. Wonderful struggles, thank God. Right? So in that sense, Rosensweig encapsulated it very, very well. And I just have time for one or two more questions, and then if not, we'll say goodbye.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Who's that?
I'm Isla. I don't think you remember us, but my husband.
Isla what?
Isla and Leff. He attended when he was in Boston helping our son. We're actually moving to Boston this month. But anyway.
Where are you now?
In Detroit.
Detroit.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm from Detroit.
Another Detroiter.
I have to talk more. But anyway, when you said about being Jewish and how you felt about it, lately in Detroit and elsewhere, I know the Hartman Institute has been talking a lot.
Sure.
And you made me think of the Jewishness of being, just being born a Jew, and the Jewishness of becoming is what they were talking about. And when I thought of that, it seems like Rosensweig and Mordecai Kaplan, which I grew up in a synagogue in Chicago that was Mordecai Kaplan influenced, and actually had him for a class at University of Michigan later in life. But
he lived to be old. He lived to be 101.
No, but he was 80 when I knew him, and
he looked great. Yeah,
he looked 60. And,
yeah, no, he had a good genes going.
I had no idea at the time, but anyway, what I heard you saying too, sort of with what they're saying, is that you become a Jew in many ways.
That's
and
right.
I heard that is Rosenzweig's struggle also.
That's
like,
right.
Yeah.
So he actively worked on becoming a Jew.
Yeah.
It wasn't just because he was born a Jew.
Right, but like and they were sort of saying it's okay, like if your becoming includes wearing tefillin, that's okay. If it doesn't include wearing tefillin,
Absolutely,
that's
absolutely. Right.
Yeah, but there's a whole progression spectrum of becoming.
Right. I would also suggest that we think about the fact that ultimately, when we think about our identities are core identity is that we are first and foremost human beings. I said we're individuals. Okay, we're human beings. To be a Jew and a human being adds something to the canvas. Now, the painting you will make with that consciousness of being a human being and a Jew will be your own. Because it has to come out of, and this is again what existentialism does, has to come out of your existential being in the world, right? No artist is painting based on a concept of somebody else's concept. Artist has to speak from his or her experience. It is speaking from his or her experience that allows me to have an experience when I look at that piece of art. Because he touches, or she touches, that human piece, right? So the human piece he touches allows me to say, oh, wow, that it may not be anything that person intended to do. It's like writers, when the people ask you, what is your book about? He says, I don't know, you read it, tell me what it's about. This is a great answer. It's a great answer, right? I don't know. For you, it might lead you, who knows? But I wrote it. I think I know what it's about, but usually writers have no idea. I put words together and I had an idea and etc. But what it means to you,
it might be different today than tomorrow.
Absolutely. Everybody says you should read some of the college books you read when you were 18 and figure out that you had no understanding. The impact was so totally different, than when you read it today. You go, wow, wasted on the young, as we say. Some of the stuff is wasted on the young. So finally, we're gonna hopefully keep studying during this summer, I hope, and I'll be part of services now. We'll be doing when Cloudy's away. I'll be doing some videos, and we'll be doing quite a stuff. So people who are getting are you getting our mail, Isla and Les? You're getting our mail, so we have a lot of stuff that's going on, and we're very blessed to have so much talent in our community. And I wish we had a better forum than Zoom, because it certainly does not help us in singing. It is totally a disaster. But we are going to use live streaming more, which still doesn't allow you to sing. I mean, you can sing in your house, but it will allow us to consider doing certain kinds of services. We are in this tremendous question now of how to get back indoors if we want to get back indoors. So wait and hear. We have a really great group of people thinking about this, and they're very serious about it, and we're going to do everything we can that it should be safe. And
things change so quickly too.
The only two positive things I heard today was that this company in Boston called Regeneron, you familiar with them?
Heard of them.
It's a big pharmaceutical group, and they have created synthetic monoclonal antibodies. Sounds good, huh? Which means it could be a treatment. Not a cure, treatment that your body's immune system will be activated and will do what it can. So if you, and they're experimenting now with people who don't have, don't have symptoms, and people who are already sick, and people, etc., or people that test positive and are not sick yet. Because many people, are being tested positive, but they're not going to get sick. So I'm optimistic we might get something by October, November that will be able to be used very widely. And even the vaccine, who's going to know? See, the vaccine you don't know for at least a year, even after you have the vaccine, right? Did it work? You don't know. But there is a company now that is being given the money that if they get the vaccine, they could do 100 million of them. To be distributed very quickly. 100 million is not enough, but it's a start. It's a start.
Red Moshe, are you immune? Do you know whether you're immune? Or?
I have my last COVID test that I took. I don't have COVID, but whether I have antibodies, it's now in Israel. I follow this a lot. In Israel, they have finally come up with where they're at the final stages of perhaps an accurate test for antibodies. The problem up to now is that these tests have been very non-accurate.
Yes.
And then the second issue is, even if you have it, there's no knowledge of whether it makes you immune or not, or the immunity lasts for a month, or it lasts for it isn't like, it's very, it's not like having the measles, I think, where you won't get it again.
Right.
Or the mumps or whatever. We just don't know, and that's what's causing a lot of our anxiety. And is that evasive and garnish? They don't know. Knows. Every day you read another study, and they don't know, and another study, and they don't know. So I thank you all, and
There's a second
Class.
thing. You said that
Stay well, everybody. Stay well.
the second one is the vaccine. The first one is this antibodies thing, right? Which should be a treatment. Love you all.
Thank you, Moshe.
Kisses and hugs. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good. Glad you were here.